All right, so you're thinking about diving into the world of parental control apps, specifically mSpy.
You're in the right place.
It's smart to do your research because this is a complicated landscape. We've got a whole stack of reviews, articles, we've even got some user comments about mSpy, all to help us and you figure this thing out.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? Just how much information is out there about mSpy. We
Yeah.
found everything from folks who absolutely swear by it to those who have some pretty serious concerns.
Yeah, it's a lot to sift through. So today we're going to try to cut through all the hype and get to the real story of mSpy. What does it actually do? Where does it fall short? And most importantly, how do you know if it's right for your family?
And right off the bat, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that mSpy is a little different than your typical parental control app. It's actually more of a monitoring tool than something that actively manages your kids' online habits.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. I noticed in one review they even called it a surveillance heavyweight, which, I mean, that kind of sounds intense, right?
It can be, yeah. mSpy is really all about information. It's like having a detailed log of everything your child is doing on their device.
Okay, so let's break down some of these features that make mSpy stand out. One that I kept seeing pop up over and over again was key logging. So for anyone who doesn't know what that means, mSpy can actually record every keystroke your kid makes, even if they delete something.
That's right. And one reviewer even mentioned that they tested it out, right? They typed in their friend's cat's name, alerted it, and then just typed cat.
Okay.
And guess what? mSpy still captured both.
Wow. So even if a child thinks they're being sneaky and deleting messages, parents can still see what they were going to say. That does seem like it could get into some, like, tricky territory.
It definitely can. And that's where things get a little tricky because
Yeah.
you have to weigh the benefits of having all that information against the potential impact on your child's trust and their privacy.
And speaking of potentially invasive features, there's also the remote camera and microphone access that's available in mSpy's Extreme package. I mean, come on, that just sounds like something out of a spy movie.
Right. It's a little wild. This is where you, as a parent, have to think long and hard about how comfortable you are with that level of monitoring. Is it necessary for your family? But even more importantly, have you talked to your child about it? Are they okay with this?
That's a really good point. Transparency and communication, they're so crucial when it comes to these types of tools.
Absolutely. And it's also worth noting that mSpy doesn't really offer much when it comes to screen time management, even though it's considered a parental control app.
Right.
It's very black and white. Block or allow apps.
Yeah.
There's no option for setting time limits, more nuanced time limits like you might see with some of the other apps out there.
Yeah, like I was reading about Custodio and XRXES,
Yeah.
and they seem to be a lot more flexible with those kinds of boundaries.
Exactly. So if your main concern is managing screen time or sort of guiding your child's online behavior, mSpy may not be the best tool for that.
Okay. So it sounds like mSpy is really good at giving parents a detailed picture of what their kid is doing online, but maybe not as much for actually like controlling their behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's really about information gathering, not necessarily behavior modification.
So now that we've got a better understanding of, the big picture with mSpy, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the features, both the good and the bad.
Let's unpack it all. What were some of the things that really stood out to you from all the testing and user feedback we've looked at?
Well, one area where mSpy seems to really excel is social media monitoring. All those reviews, they were really praising mSpy for just how thorough it is.
Interesting. So what specifically about that feature really impressed you?
It seems like it can cover pretty much every major social media platform, even retrieving deleted messages on things like Snapchat. And one reviewer even mentioned that it was faster, like syncing WhatsApp messages, faster than other parental control apps they'd tried.
Ah, that syncing speed. I bet that could be a major advantage if you need to quickly figure out what's going on, especially if you think your child might be in a risky situation.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, isn't it? They boast about how well it works for social media, but they don't really tell you which platforms specifically.
Right.
They just say, oh, it's great for social media.
Yeah.
But thankfully, it sounds like the user feedback kind of fills in those gaps. It gives you a more realistic picture of, how it actually performs in real-world situation.
Yeah, that's the beauty of those user experiences, right? They highlight those little nuances that you wouldn't necessarily get just from reading a marketing brochure.
Absolutely.
Another feature that got some pretty consistently positive feedback was the location tracking. It seems to be really detailed, even includes geofencing capabilities.
Ah, yes, geofencing. So For anyone who might not be familiar, that's basically like setting up virtual boundaries on a map, right?
Yeah.
And then you get an alert if your child enters or leaves those areas. And I mean, for some parents, that's a huge deal.
Yeah, it does sound really helpful, but I did notice one reviewer mentioned that in their testing, the location tracking was a bit delayed, and the geofencing alerts weren't always reliable.
Ah, see, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Even with all the fancy technology, there can still be those little hiccups. I wonder if those delays are something that, they're actively working to fix.
I don't know, but I mean, it is definitely something to think about because if you are relying on this like for real-time safety, those delays could be a problem.
Right, absolutely. And it really does highlight how important it is to not just take the company's word for it, but to really do your research, read those user reviews.
Yeah. And then there were the activity reports. So mSpy generates these really detailed activity reports. And according to the sources we looked at, you get data on calls, contacts, websites visited. I mean, you name it, it's in there.
That's true. You can even export all of it. It seems like this is where mSpy's focus on information really comes into play, because you essentially end up with a comprehensive record of everything your child is doing digitally. But it also raises an interesting question, right? Why is this data valuable to you? What are you trying to see? Are you looking for evidence of specific behaviors? Are you simply looking for peace of mind? Or are you just trying to get a better overall understanding of how your kid behaves online?
Yeah, it seems like the value of this feature really depends on what each parent is hoping to get out of it.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool, no doubt about it. But it's up to each parent to really think about how to use that information responsibly and ethically.
So while mSpy does seem to have some impressive strengths, especially in terms of, its monitoring capabilities, the sources we looked at also pointed out some pretty big limitations. And one that jumped out at me was the lack of, category-based website filtering.
Yeah. So if you choose mSpy, you're going to be stuck manually blocking every single website that you don't want your child to see. And honestly, who has time for that?
It sounds like a nightmare, honestly, especially, as kids get older and their interests change. It seems like it would be practically impossible to keep up with.
Totally agree. And on top of that, I read that in some cases, those keyword alerts that we were talking about, they didn't even work reliably during testing.
Oh, wow. Okay, that seems like a pretty big deal. Because, I mean, if a feature that's supposed to flag potentially harmful content isn't even working properly, that's kind of undermining the whole point, right?
Exactly. It's like having a security system with a broken alarm. Can you really trust it to do its job?
Not really. So this brings us to another really important part of our deep dive. What are real people saying about mSpy? What's the actual user experience like?
Yeah, let's get into that human element. Because, looking at all the user feedback we were able to gather, it seems like the experiences are all over the map. It's like it reflects those different parenting styles and priorities that we were talking about earlier.
Definitely a mixed bag. What kind of feedback stood out to you?
Well, on one hand, you've got those parents who absolutely love mSpy. They're raving about it. They talk about how it gives them that peace of mind. They love all those detailed tracking features. And a lot of them, they also say that the customer service is excellent.
So it sounds like for some parents, mSpy is really meeting a need. That reassurance, that kind of insight into their kids' digital world.
Right. It gives them that sense of control. But then on the other hand, there are users who express some pretty big concerns about privacy, especially when it comes to, teenagers.
Yeah, I saw a lot of comments calling it creepy and intrusive, which I can totally understand because teenagers, they're already going through so much. And to feel like the parents are, watching their every move, that could be pretty damaging to that parent-child relationship.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
It really does raise those big questions about finding that balance. How do you keep your kids safe from all those online dangers, but also respect their need for privacy as they grow up?
It's tough. There's no easy answer.
There really isn't.
On the one hand, safety. But then on the other hand, you don't want to stifle their development or make them feel like they can't trust you.
Right. It's a delicate dance. And I don't know. I don't think there's a perfect answer for everybody. Each family has got to figure out what works for them. Ideally, through open communication and just understanding each other.
Speaking of communication, I did notice that some users mentioned concerns about a lack of transparency from mSpy itself.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean?
Well, some people felt like the company wasn't really upfront about the privacy implications of using their software. And others felt that the marketing was kind of misleading, making mSpy sound like it was more about parental control than it really is.
That's a valid point. It really is crucial for these companies that are offering these types of products to be completely honest about what they do and what they don't do. And they need to be upfront about, those ethical considerations.
Yeah, because parents need to have all the information to make good decisions about this stuff,
Right.
right?
Absolutely. And that information needs to be, easy to understand, not buried in some long legal document or full of tech jargon that nobody understands.
Yeah, it shouldn't feel like you need a law degree just to figure out what you're actually getting into.
Exactly.
So it sounds like even if a parent does decide that mSpy is the right tool for them, they need to have those open and honest conversations with their child about what's being monitored and why.
Absolutely. You got to build that foundation of trust and mutual respect. It's so important.
So it really all comes back to that core question, right? What are you actually trying to solve by using a parental control app?
Right. That's the big one. Is it safety? Is it screen time? Are you just trying to understand your child's online behavior?
And once you've figured that out, you can then start to think about, okay, is mSpy the right tool for this specific problem?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, if you decide that mSpy isn't the right fit, that's okay. There are so many other parental control apps out there. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the user experience and the ethics, all that stuff, but let's circle back to the technical side of things for a minute, because one area where mSpy seems to really fall short, at least according to the reviews, is its web filtering capabilities.
Yeah, that seems to be a common complaint. A lot of users were really frustrated by the lack of category-based filtering. I mean, imagine having to block every single website manually.
Ugh, that's just way too much work.
I know, right?
With all the content that's out there, it's like trying to, empty the ocean with a teaspoon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just not practical. And like we were saying earlier, this kind of lack of control seems to be a theme with mSpy. It's great for monitoring, not so great for actually managing behavior.
So it's less about shaping your kid's online experience and more about just seeing what they're doing.
Yeah, pretty much. And for some parents, that might be enough.
Right.
But for others, it might feel like a big letdown.
And, we were just talking about those keyword alerts and how they weren't always reliable.
Yeah, you'd think that something like that would be a pretty basic feature to get right.
I know, right? It's supposed to notify you if your child uses certain words or phrases online, but some users said that it wouldn't always trigger even when those keywords were clearly there.
That's pretty concerning, right? I mean, that's one of those features that you really want to be able to rely on.
Absolutely. Because, at the end of the day, it's about protecting kids. And if a core feature like that isn't working, it makes you wonder about the reliability of the entire app.
It's like that smoke detector analogy again. If it only goes off half the time, can you really trust it to keep you safe?
Not really. So it seems like even though mSpy advertises itself as having all these super advanced features, there are still some kinks to work out.
Yeah, and it's important for anyone who's considering mSpy to be aware of those limitations.
Yeah.
Because no software is perfect.
Okay. And last but not least, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The price. mSpy is not cheap.
It's true. It's definitely on the higher end of the spectrum when it comes to parental control apps. And like we talked about earlier, you have to pay for each device separately.
So for families with multiple kids, that cost can really add up.
Absolutely. And that's where it comes down to, is it worth it for you? What's that value proposition?
Yeah, you have to weigh those benefits against the cost. And some families might decide it's worth every penny, but for others, it might just be too much.
Right. It's not just about whether you can afford it. It's about whether it's actually worth the money for your family's needs.
All right, so let's do a quick recap of what we've learned. mSpy, powerful monitoring tool, can give you a ton of information about your child's online activities.
But it's not without its limitations.
Right. Those technical limitations, the ethical considerations, the cost, these are all things you have to think about seriously.
And ultimately, the decision of whether to use mSpy or any parental control app for that matter, it's a personal one.
It's a family decision.
A family decision, that's right. You have to have those conversations, weigh the pros and cons, and figure out what's best for your own unique situation.
It all comes back to finding that balance, right? Protecting your child, but also respecting their growing independence.
Exactly. And in the digital age, that's one of the biggest challenges parents face.
Yeah.
It's interesting, you bring up that point about knowing everything versus fostering trust.
Yeah.
Because looking at the user feedback, it seems like that's a real tension point for a lot of parents.
Yeah, for sure. Some parents find mSpy super reassuring, while others find it, kind of unsettling.
It really is a mixed bag, isn't it? And I think a lot of it comes down to, individual parenting styles, comfort levels. What feels right for one family might feel totally wrong for another.
Absolutely. And there's no one right way to parent, especially when it comes to technology.
Right. Every family has to figure out their own approach.
One thing that stood out to me as I was going through the reviews was how people's perceptions of mSpy seem to change depending on the age of the child. Like parents of younger kids, they tend to be more enthusiastic about it.
Oh, yeah.
But parents of teenagers, they seem to have a lot more reservations.
That makes sense, right? When you're dealing with younger kids, it's all about safety and protection. You want to know where they are, who they're talking to, what they're seeing online.
Yeah.
But as kids get older, those needs kind of shift.
Exactly. Teenagers, they need more space, more autonomy, more privacy. And I can see how something like mSpy could feel like a huge invasion of privacy for a teen.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's where those ethical considerations become even more complicated. You have to think about, okay, am I actually harming my relationship with my child by doing this?
It's like walking a tightrope.
Right.
You want to keep them safe, but you also don't want to damage that trust.
It's a tough balance to strike. And honestly, there's no easy answer. Every family has to find their own path,
Sure.
Hopefully through open communication and, just understanding each other.
Speaking of communication, I noticed that some users raised concerns about the lack of transparency from mSpy itself.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean?
Well, some people felt like the company wasn't really being upfront about the privacy implications of using their software, like what it actually means to have all this data being collected. And others felt like the marketing materials were a little misleading, making mSpy sound like it was more about parental control than it really is.
Yeah. I mean, it is really important for companies that offer these kinds of products to be honest about what they do and, what they don't do. And they need to be upfront about those ethical implications.
I think a lot of parents, they just want to know that they're making informed decisions, right?
Absolutely. And, that information should be easy to find and easy to understand.
Yeah, it shouldn't be buried in some 50-page legal document.
Exactly.
So it sounds like even if a parent does decide that mSpy is a good fit for their family, they really need to have those open and honest conversations with their kid about what's being monitored and why.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Building that foundation of trust. Not trying to be sneaky or anything like that.
And that brings us back to that core question of it.
What's the problem you're trying to solve?
Exactly. What are you actually hoping to accomplish by using a parental control app?
Are you worried about your child's safety? Are you trying to manage screen time? Or are you just curious about, what they're doing online?
Once you've answered that question, then you can start to think about, okay, is mSpy the right tool for this?
Right. Because if it's not, that's okay. There are other options out there.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the user experience, the ethical stuff, all of that. But let's go back to the technical side of things for a minute, because one area where mSpy seems to be lacking is in those web filtering capabilities.
Yeah, a lot of users were really frustrated by that. Like, imagine having to block every single website individually.
I know, it's crazy.
It's just not practical. And it kind of goes back to that thing we were talking about earlier, the lack of control. mSpy, it's great for monitoring, but not so much for actually managing what your child can and can't access.
Right. So you're basically just getting a window into their online world, but you're not really able to shape it.
Pretty much. And like I said, for some parents, that's all they want. But for others, it's a deal breaker.
And then there's the issue with those keyword alerts, not always being reliable.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising that they haven't been able to get that right yet.
I know, you would think that would be a pretty basic feature.
Right. It's supposed to let you know if your child uses certain words or phrases online. But some people said that it wouldn't always work.
Even when those keywords were right there in the text.
That's a little worrying, right? Because that's a feature that you really need to be able to count on.
Absolutely. If you can't trust it to work, then what's the point?
Exactly. And when it comes to protecting kids online, reliability is everything.
So even though mSpy markets itself as this super advanced high-tech solution, it seems like there are still some glitches they need to iron out.
Yeah. No software is perfect.
Yeah.
And mSpy is no exception.
Okay. And of course, we can't forget about the price.
The price.
It's definitely one of the more expensive parental control apps out there.
It's true. And like we said before, you have to pay for each device separately.
So if you've got multiple kids, it can get pretty pricey.
Absolutely. And that's where you have to ask yourself, okay, is it worth it?
Right. What are you getting for your money? Is it worth the investment?
And that's a question that only you can answer. It depends on your budget, your needs, your priorities.
So let's do a quick recap of everything we've talked about so far. mSpy is a powerful monitoring tool. It can give you a ton of information about your child's digital activity,
But it also has its downsides.
the lack of control, the potential privacy issues, the cost. These are all things to think about carefully.
And at the end of the day, the decision of whether or not to use mSpy or any parental control app for that matter, it's a personal one.
It's a family
A
decision.
family decision, that's right. Have those conversations. Weigh those pros and cons and figure out what feels right for you.
It all comes back to finding that balance, right? Protecting your kid, but also giving them the space to grow.
And that's something every parent struggles with.
So we've really gone deep on mSpy, haven't we? We've looked at its features, what it does well, where it struggles, what users are saying, and of course, all those ethical questions.
It's been a really thorough exploration. And hopefully, by now our listeners feel like they have enough information to decide if mSpy is right for them.
Yeah, I think we've given them a lot to chew on. So let's try to bring it all together now. Is mSpy worth it?
That's the big question, isn't it? And like we've been saying throughout this whole deep dive, there's no easy answer.
Right. It all depends.
It really does. What works for one family might be a total disaster for another.
So as we wrap up here, let's leave everyone with a few key things to remember.
Sounds good. What are some of the big takeaways?
Okay, well, first of all, remember that mSpy is a monitoring tool. It's not really designed to help you manage your kids' behavior or their screen time.
Right. It's more about giving you the information.
Exactly. It's like having a secret agent tracking your kid's digital footprint.
Right. You'll see everything, but it's up to you to decide what to do with all that information.
And that brings us to another really important point, communication. If you do decide to use mSpy, talk to your child. Be open and honest with them about what you're doing and why.
Absolutely. Don't try to sneak it onto their devices. That's not going to end well.
Right. That just creates a whole other set of problems. And even if you are monitoring their activity, it's still important to give them some space.
Yeah, you have to trust them.
Let them have some privacy, let them grow and make their own mistakes.
It's all about finding that balance, right?
Protection versus freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not easy, but it's one of the most important things parents have to navigate these days.
So to sum it all up, mSpy, powerful tool, but it's not a magic solution.
It comes with some big responsibilities.
You have to weigh those pros and cons,
Yeah.
talk to your kids, and most importantly, think about what you're really hoping to achieve.
Because at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong answer here. What matters is that you make a decision that feels right for your family.
That's it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into mSpy. We hope it's been helpful.
It's been great being here. And to all the parents out there, just remember, stay involved, stay informed, and most importantly, stay connected with your kids.